Hello, everybody, and welcome. We see you rolling in. J.Thelander here, along with Matt from Scalar. Hi, Matt.
Hi, Jody. Great to be here. Good to
Yeah,
see you.
perfect. You too. So I'm just going to get started as folks are coming in. We'll get right to it. So I'm J.Thelander, founder and CEO of J.Thelander Consulting. And for those of you who are new to us, welcome. We cover compensation for the private capital markets. So really all aspects. What that means in layperson terms is that we run surveys that are open all year round with real-time data that covers companies from tech to life sciences and really everything in between AI, consumer, biotech, medical device, health tech. And we look at all aspects of the compensation. And we have a great relationship with Scalar because we know about the equity percentages and how it relates to the full comp model with cash. But Matt and the Scalar team have another angle on it. So, Matt, I'm going to turn it over to you to make the intro.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Jody. I'm Matt Tillotson, managing director here at Scalar. Scalar is a full service valuation firm. So we do valuations for all kinds of reasons of private companies, but largely for companies issuing equity as compensation. That's one of the main types of valuations we do. We work with, thousands of companies a year across the country and even world, but really focus on institutionally backed companies, so venture and private
Venture,
equity
yeah.
backed companies. Yeah.
Well, that's the golden ticket, right? So I'm going to jump right in because obviously private companies, the distinction with a private company versus a public company is having the equity, and the equity is ideally the wealth creation, but knowing not only what you own, but how you own it and understanding the best ways to approach that are obviously where you find out in a happy way that you've done the right thing as you come on the heels of a liquidity. And so that's what we're all here positioned for. We would like this session to be, I know we're here for 30 minutes so because we're sensitive to everybody's time, but we are monitoring the chat. So if there are questions that you would like answered or for us to explain something more, Morgan on my team just put it up here into the notes so you can join the session. Will be interactive and you can utilize the chat function. So without further ado, I'm going to get into a little bit of data by way of background as well. So as I mentioned, we're a private capital market firm on all aspects of compensation. We've had some really nice media this year in Fortune and Forbes and Axios, so gives us a nice spot in the media. And we also would love for you to subscribe to our Caplander podcast. It's really been going well. We've had a lot of industry experts on it. Matt, we're going to have to do one on valuations and have you or someone from the Scalar team do it with us. So we've had a
Sure,
lot
I'd
of
love to.
VCs and yeah, other great people. So we hope
Absolutely.
you take a look at that. It's in all the usual places. And Morgan just put the link to that as well. So let's go, as we said, by way of background, that the industries that we cover for our data is biotech, medical device, and tech. And within tech, that's AI. We have, multiple areas, multiple industry sectors, and it does make a difference in terms of how you look at compensation, the cash equity mix. And the other piece that really makes a difference is the total amount of financing. So I'm going to take a breath here, Matt, and let you discuss you talked about the private companies that have raised institutional money, but there are even, a company might do a valuation even if they've raised under 5 million. We know the private markets are staying private so much longer now, so you could even be raising capital upwards of 200 million. So walk us through your private company. You've raised your friends and family round, moving into your first VC-backed round or institutional money. What happens with the valuation here? When do we come to you?
Yeah, so you would get a valuation done anytime you're granting equity. But obviously at the various stages, our valuation approach probably changes a little bit. At the earliest stages, pre-revenue, we might be looking backwards on what has been invested to date. And, obviously the valuation implied from the fundraising. At the later stages, we're looking at public comps or M&A comps and revenue multiples. And you do see a change. Another question we often get is what is common worth as a percentage of preferred? Because we're valuing common, that's usually what the strike price for options, but we raise
Right.
preferred. And that can change across the stage as well, depending on how much money you've raised and the terms of the
And
preferred.
it's really not, I have another slide. I'm not going to show it just to spare everybody, but we do look at most recent series of financing. And in my opinion, the better way is to look at total amount of financing because that's really more of a precise number. And we've had this discussion even as recently with the Wall Street Journal reporter around total amount of financing versus series of financing and then these mega rounds because the financing's taking longer. So when you do raise the capital, it can be a bigger round, and that's more accurate. What's your take on that from the Scalar opinion?
Yeah, absolutely. There's nothing that dictates that a company has to call this round a Series A or this round a Series B. And so we see more mature Series A3 companies than
Right.
Series C companies. So I think total raised is probably a better way to bucket for your purposes to bucket kind of stage of a company.
Okay, so that's the first takeaway for everybody who's on with us. Look at total amount of financing as your inflection point for your compensation, as well as that's what Scalar would use for valuation. I'm going to show another slide because I really think this is so helpful to understand the data as well. That where are these companies based? So our number has gone down. We used to have 90% of our companies be in the United States, and that's now moving. We've got a nice uptick in Europe. And then we also separate the UK from Europe because there are differences between the different locations. And then within the United States, you can see, I mean, I used to be that 40% of our companies were based in Northern California. So when you're doing a valuation, does it matter where the company is located?
Not necessarily. Obviously, companies located in hot markets, going after hot technology might raise at higher valuations, but it's really the fact that they raised at a higher valuation that impacts our analysis, not necessarily where they're located.
Okay, well, talk to us for a minute about that because I think it can be cute, it can be confusing. I can't even get the word out. It's so confusing. Um, Talk about what they raised the money at the valuation with. We're sort of jumping to something that we had discussed versus what the value is of the equity. So if it's a higher valuation and then it's a lower valuation, what happens here?
Yeah, so I think what you're asking is oftentimes people will ask us, well, why do I need to get a valuation when I just raised money? And so I kind of know what my valuation is. I just raised $10 million at a $50 million post. Why do I need to get a valuation? And the answer is usually because you're granting options in common stock. So let's say the preferred stock was $1 at that 10 million, $50 million post, but that isn't necessarily the fair market value of your common stock. And oftentimes there's an incentive to be at the lower end of the defensible range. And so that's where a 401 valuation comes in and says, okay, yeah, your preferred stock is worth $1, but your common stock, as a result, it has lesser economics and things, is only worth 35 or 40 cents or
Right.
20.
So the post-money valuation of the company may not necessarily be the exact amount of the 409A valuation, which is really the most important number here in terms of what the equity strike price is.
Yeah, the 401 usually comes in lower than the post money because a post money is a pretty simple rudimentary calculation that says percentage purchased by dollars given for percentage purchased, but that's a shares-based percentage. And in reality, if a company purchased 10% of your company, depending on the terms and the outcome, they might actually get 20% or 30% or 15%, depending on the outcome. And so the economic ownership percentage might be different than the
Right.
shares-based ownership percentage.
Very important. Okay, I'm going to show. So this can affect in a private company depending on your stage. We here at Thelander survey all these job titles from chiefs, a lot of chiefs, VPs, directors, staff level, a tremendous amount of staff level companies. Everything in green is part of our give to get model. So I'll put a plug in here for the survey because it's so important, right? Everybody needs this data, and we are not a payroll plugin because we gather so much more data around option pools, change of control and severance, salary increases, and bonuses. So all the green jobs here are given to you as for your participation. So it's a give to get model. You participate in the survey, You get access to the online platform for a year, and all the jobs in green are part of that for no charge. So I really encourage you to participate. And of course, if we're missing a job title that's important to you, we're always really flexible because, of course, a company who participates and you give us all these jobs and the one job you care about isn't on the platform and you're just no charge access, we're happy to give that to you. So let's talk about equity grants because this is really the crux of it. I want to make sure that we cover two things, sort of what are equity grants and then the amount of equity grants depending on the job title and the financing. So you hit on this, Matt, for a second, sort of what type of equity awards do you currently grant?
Yeah, so we do valuations for all kinds of equity grants. You've got four listed here. I mean, there's
Right,
the amount of arrows in this quiver are very numerous, but generally it's some form of, for a C Corp, a stock option, or for an LLC, a profits interest, or
right.
restricted stock unit, restricted stock award.
Right. And the what I know just from my doing this enough times with lawyers on with us is that the RSUs and the restricted stock awards have a different tax treatment, but really the bulk of the companies, this is a check all that apply job. They are granted incentive stock options, ISOs, right? And then you can see this by the different types of financing. And I show you this slide because I think it's really important to see that it stays pretty consistent that ISOs are the biggest type of equity that's given. And that's where you are granted ideally at a lower value, and then there is a liquidity event, and you are tax capital gains on the spread, and that's where the valuation is so important. So explain that if you're a company now who's raised, let's say 15 to $50 million, and I come to you because I've just raised that money, what happens with the 409A?
Yeah, so I mean, the process, generally speaking, is somebody like us get your financials and your cap table information. We start work on our side. We'll have some questions. There'll be some back and forth, but ultimately, we arrive at a value per common share. And if it's options, that will be set as the strike price, that or higher. You can go higher, but you can't go lower. Is set as the
Right.
strike price for those grants. If it's restricted stock, and sorry, the options are nice because it's deferred income. And so the recipient does not have to pay tax immediately. If it's restricted stock, there can be some immediate tax ramifications.
That's the
Either
biggest
way,
difference.
yeah,
Yeah.
either way, the recipient probably wants it to be as low as is defensible. The company usually is on board with that because it helps for recruiting purposes, but sometimes the incentives differ at the company level. But typically it's, hey, here's a range of reasonableness. Can we defend the lower end of that range?
Right. And then this slide, I know that we looked at this together because this is really ties to the valuation and why the comp and the valuation sort of go hand in hand because we ask about if you have an evergreen sort of refresh program. So this is predicated on the fact that you as a private company have raised your first round of financing or you've raised additional equity. So there's been dilution on the equity that people have. And now, so you own, or you've been granted a smaller piece of a bigger pie. And there is then you need to have a different valuation, right? So it can be as needed or after financing. So if you're going to give additional equity, let's say it's as needed or after financing, when would you do another valuation?
Uh, I should say this data is pretty interesting to us because we don't have the insight as to how who is receiving the grants for the valuation we're doing. So I'm fascinated by this chart as well. But to answer your question, you need a valuation in place anytime you're making option grants. Sometimes we have clients that do, one grant every 3 years, and so they just occasionally do valuations. But more often than not, especially venture-backed companies, they're granting all the time, right? Quarterly or monthly throughout the year. And so in that case, the the tax law is written that you should have a valuation in place at least every 12 months or until a material event. That material event, a new financing is always that material
Material
event.
event.
So I would say a new financing is probably the biggest driver of getting a refreshed 401A valuation or some kind of other equity compensation valuation. And it's probably based on that data that you just showed, the biggest driver of thinking about refreshing
Well, let's show
equity
this. So I,
grants.
I love this part right here. This part really sort of brings it all out. So this is the crux of it. This is why these 30-minute bites are so great because The crux of it is that this shows you, for example, a CEO, right? This is let me back up for 1 second, the different compensation levers so we all have the same definition. So we show base salary means obviously your annual salary, and the current bonus in the Thelander definition means it was given. It was you earned that bonus. It was already given to you. And then the target bonus means that it's out on the horizon for the next year. So total cash can be a combination of base pay and a current bonus if you had a bonus program, or it can just be your base pay. Might make sense? Okay. And if it makes sense to you, I'm
Makes
assuming
sense
it
to
makes
me.
sense
Yeah.
to everybody else. Although I get the question all the time, why doesn't the base salary plus the current bonus equal the total cash? And you're like, it's different sample sizes because not everybody has a bonus program. And then
Right.
equity. Obviously, the reason that we're on this webinar today is that we have founder shares. So ideally, that goes to, in theory, the early people who founded the company. And that is as a percent of fully diluted shares. And let's say you have a founder CEO, and then that founder CEO gets diluted down. You raise more capital, so then they start to get into additional equity, but it's a different equity than the person who comes in from the outside being a non-founder. So how this works in effect, this slide shows you for a CEO median total cash and equity. This is across all industries. We just are sort of using this sort of to explain really what happens. So on the bottom is the total amount of capital raised under 5 million, 5 to 15, 15 to 30, 30 to 50, 50 to 90. And this is coming from a new tool on the Thelander platform, our comp planning tool, which people can actually subscribe to so they can do this as well. And the lines will show their own data, which is great. It's sort of year over year planning as well and showing out and I have a question for you, Matt. And this shows you that this line here is the non-founder equity, right? And you can see when you're under 5 million in total financing, excuse me, this is the founder, non-founder has 13.5%. And that gets diluted down once you raise more capital and stays pretty close to 5%. So that means even though they got diluted, they got more equity. But that's where the valuation would show what the strike price is for that percentage of equity, correct?
Yeah, correct. And that's
Right.
interesting. So there would have to be refresh grants for a CEO to stay at 5%, assuming
Right.
that I know this doesn't totally represent the life cycle of a company, but it could. For
It's
them
the
to
idea of
stay at
it.
five, yes, for them to stay at 5%, there would have to be refresh grants, which
Right.
again, we don't have a ton of insight into this, but we at least hear of executives getting refresh grants when a new capital raise happens.
Well, people ask all the time, how often do you refresh? And that's where the as needed or after financing, because it really matters how well you did to start with the right numbers because you're going to get diluted down and then how well you get refreshed. So there's no one golden rule. And
Yeah.
then the equity up here is the founder total equity. It could be a combination of the original founder grant, or it could be founder grant plus additional equity for that founder. And you can see the same thing, dilution. And of course, the other component to remember here is that the more capital you raise, the higher the total cash. It's like very simple. We had a question for you. For Matt, how long does a 409A valuation take and how much does it cost? What is needed from the founder?
Yeah, great question. So
Yeah,
a
great
4 A
question.
typically takes 1 to 2 weeks, but we can turn around quick. Sometimes, I might get a call today that says, I got a board meeting on Friday. Can you start and finish it by then? And the answer is yes. But standard time is 1 to 2 weeks. We try to turn around an initial draft within 5 to 7 business days. Time requirement on the company side is usually 2 or 3 15 to 30 minute calls. Call it 2 15 to 30 minute calls. And then whatever time they spend getting us the documents, which are financials and cap table and a few other things. And then however long they want to spend reviewing it. So it's usually from a time requirement, it's not that burdensome on the company side. Cost on our side to do a 4A or really any equity grant is usually call it 3,500 to 5,500 for really early stage seed companies. Sometimes we'll do it as low as 3K. So 3 to 5,500 is generally the range, though it can be a little bit higher for complex
Yeah,
companies.
I can attest to this. I'm a perfect live. endorsement because I use Scalar and I had a valuation done and it was it was so easy and it was such a pleasure and I felt like I needed to ask very simple questions and the answers were I wasn't nervous to ask and it was very helpful. So um, great job and very painless, I will say, much because you're sort of nervous going into it the first time, wondering what's going to happen, but you did a great
Yeah.
job.
Yeah, no, we're happy to.
We
Thank
had a
you for
question,
answering.
are refresh grants the same as top-up grants in the UK language? And they are. And I think that's such a great question because it's really important. I'm going to show you here is an example of a more junior position. And again, this is from the comp tool that we have at Thelander that looks at the different financings and can show you the percentiles of what's happening. This is for a senior scientist because it's not all about only the executives. There are a lot of really key roles that are very important also to make sure that the equity is right and that there's either a top up or refresh. Because at a certain point, if you're giving everybody in the company equity when they are first hired, which happens in early stage companies and private companies, because everyone's very excited, they want to give everyone equity so they're aligned with the business. But at a certain point, when you raise more capital, then cash is more available and equity becomes the golden egg. And it's harder to give everybody equity. So you can't refresh or top up the whole team. You got to figure out, this is part of the comp philosophy, who you're going to give it to. So oftentimes it can be someone like a senior scientist. And so this is when they raise less than $50 million and then the 50 to $150 million. So you can see that the total cash, as you would expect, continues to go up. And the equity is also the non-founder equity, the different percentiles, they're getting diluted down as you raise more capital. And so it really, the or the top ups depend on how good of a job you did getting everybody to these numbers to start with, right? Because if you ended up giving the equity at closer to 0.5% for a senior scientist, and then they get diluted down, they may not get a refresh grant just because they got diluted. It depends where that refresh lands them against the market data and also how valuable that person is to your team. So when you do the whole valuation, explain, like, is that for everybody in the company? Is one price applies to everybody?
Yep, yep. One applies surprise applies to everybody, and so again, there might be some nuance on type of grants being received, but generally speaking, it's what is your common stock worth, whether you're giving sometimes straight common stock or restricted stock or
Right.
options, and therefore setting the strike price. Yeah, the the junior engineer and the
All the
CTO
same.
will be using the same valuation. What percentage of the company they get, that's where, the rubber meets the road with your data.
Right. And it is a very important. Then we have another question, but it's really important for those of you that are on the webinar to think about it as a percentage. Because if somebody gives you a number, you can't tell what that is, even if it's a big number or a small number. You have to know what it is a percentage of fully diluted shares. So,
Yeah.
Matt, this is a question for you, is that how early in a startup's life would it make sense to do a 409A? And I know you think is really early as possible after the first institutional round, right?
Yeah, yeah. Generally speaking, you and a friend form a company, brand new idea stage. Usually your equity set at par value. You don't need a valuation. But above that, as there starts, if you've raised money or created value that's clearly, above par
You know you're
value,
gonna, right,
it's
you're
probably safe
running.
to get a valuation. Yeah.
And that really, this is the part that I really cannot emphasize enough. And that's also the time that we just had a call this morning with the women's health company with offices in both Oxford in the UK, as well as in San Francisco. And they've just raised a seed round of financing, and then they're moving into raising their first institutional money, probably upwards of 15 million. And they knew that along with the valuation work, that they also have to do the comp planning and setting up their infrastructure about who gets what. Because once you get your house in order in all levels, it mitigates issues. So we did have another question about and we tried to avoid this discussion around 83B elections, but it came up. So let's address it.
Yeah.
Do you recommend electing an 83B for an executive joining a new company to early exercise? So maybe you could break down what an 83B election is.
Yeah, yeah, great question. And it's technically a tax question. I'm not a tax professional, but I know enough about
Right.
this that I could answer the question, which is when you receive restricted stock, And this doesn't apply for options, but when you receive a restricted stock, you're basically getting shares, right? Just straight stock. The restricted nature is because it vests. And so sure, you receive 10,000 shares, but really they vest 2,500 each year for 4 years. You can either choose, hey, I want to pretend as if I got those 10,000 shares today and pay taxes on them today, or I will just pay taxes on the 2,500 and then the next chunk
Okay, the
as they
4 year,
vest.
typically the 4 year vesting.
Yeah, exactly. And whether or not to make that election depends on a lot of things, specifically your outlook on the company's growth in the future relative to its value today. But more often than not, the stock received is worth very little when it is received, in which
So
case you
it's
definitely
cheaper
want to
to
make the,
pay.
yeah, if
Right,
it's zero or close to zero, you can't get any better than that from a tax perspective, so you should make the
right.
election. If it's higher, then there's some other judgment factors to consider.
I'm going to show our last set of slides here just to be sensitive to everybody's time. So if you have any questions as we wind up here, please feel free to send them through the chat and we'll answer them. But this is all a part of the greater plan of the option pool. So this is part of not only understanding who gets what, but this shows the percentage of fully diluted ownership, all reported data, meaning this is not broken down by industry or by total financing. And really, the financing is where it shifts. So you start out, and it could be that you have founders. Really, the percentages here, the 25 and the 50th and the 75th percentile, depend on how many founders you have. And then this is the global data, the same thing, the founders data. And then this is excluding the US. You can see the investors. So we're starting here very low, but here the investors immediately, excluding the US, tend to own more. So for those of you that are in European or globally outside of the US, it's better to really know this because the founders, I think, are a little less sophisticated and don't ask for as much in the beginning, right? And that's why the investors get more. We're seeing this shift a little bit globally, but then this is where you can see, and if you look by the financing, which is probably more exact. So the main thing to see here is look, this employee pool is staying around 15%, 10 to 15%. And here is the global data, it's 10 to 15%. And that's what you really need to keep on hand at all times to be able to grant equity. And so at the early stage, you see that the employee pool is still somewhere in that 10 to 15%. Founders own more, and then investors. And I'm going to switch all the way to a late stage company. The employee pool is still 10 to 15%, and the founders have been diluted, and the investors own more. And it's important to be able to reserve equity for future option plans, for granted in refresh, and then in new hire grants. But the piece that really ties into the scalar component, and then we'll wind up with this, is that it's important not only to get your equity, but then also to do the 409A valuation and as soon as possible because you want to make sure that you're leveraging the fact for an early stage company that that strike price is probably lower in the beginning and then it's going to get higher as the company becomes, more stable and more sophisticated.
Yeah, absolutely. I think equity is arguably, the most valuable type of compensation in a lot of these companies. So it's really important to get it right from a percentage amount, and that's where your data comes in play. And then obviously to do it right from a defensibility and, employee benefit and removing any potential tax liability going forward. And that's where we can help out with the valuation.
Yeah, because it is a holistic component here. Making sure you get the equity percentages right and that you look at your option plan and you make sure the type of equity that you're granting is what you want to grant. And then to do the valuation on a annual basis or if you have a significant event like a financing, because it's important that you set a moment in time and that you get the equity value so that you can plan for your wealth creation and a potential liquidity. So that's my parting words. Anything else from you, Matt, as we wind up?
No, really, really appreciate you having me. Pleasure speaking with everyone. If additional valuation questions do arise or valuation needs, obviously, we're always happy to hop on a call and be a resource to
Yeah,
whomever.
we'll send out a thank you. We would love everybody to participate, and we'll send out coordinates so that we can stay in touch and see how we can help. All right, everybody. Thank you. Enjoy. If you're here, you're a happy Memorial weekend. I know there's a bank holiday coming up too. So happy, healthy, and stay safe. Thank you.